Chapter 12. Lord Prestor's ascension seems almost inevitable. The shadowy form in the emerald sphere informed Crossus. He has an almost amazing gift of persuasion. You're correct. He must be a wizard. Seated in the midst of his sanctum, Crossus eyed the globe. Convincing the monarchs will require much evidence. Their mistrust in the Carantor grows with each day, and that can only also be the work of this would-be king. The other speaker, the elder woman from the inner council, nodded back. We've begun watching. The only trouble is, this Prestor proves very elusive. He seems able to enter and leave his abode without us knowing. Crossus pretended a slight surprise. How is that possible? We don't know. Worse, his chateau is surrounded by some very nasty spell work. We almost lost Drendon to one of those surprises. That Drendon, the baritone inebriated mage, had nearly fallen victim to one of Deathwing's traps, momentarily dismayed Crossus. Despite the man's bluster, the dragon represented the other mage's abilities. Losing Drendon at a time like this could prove costly. We must move with caution, he urged. I will speak with you again soon. What are you planning, Crossus? A search into this young noble's past. You think you'll find anything? The hooded wizard shrugged. We can only hope. He dismissed her image, then leaned back to consider. Crossus regretted that he had to lead his associates astray, if only for their own good. At least their intrusions into Deathwing's mortal affairs would have been the result of distracting the back. At least their intrusions into Deathwing's mortal affairs would have the result of distracting the Black. That would give Crossus a bit more time. He only prayed that no one else would risk themselves as Dreden had done. The Carantor would need their strength intact if the other kingdoms turned on them. His own excursion to the visit Malagos had ended with little sense of satisfaction. Malagos had promised only to consider his request. Crossus suspected that the great dragon believed he could deal with Deathwing in his own sweet time. Little did the silver-blue Leviathan realize that time no longer remained for any of the dragons. If Deathwing could not be stopped now, he might never be. Which left Crossus with one much undesired choice now. I must do it. He had to seek out the other great ones, the other aspects, convince one of them, and he might still gain Malagos' sworn aid. Yet, she of the dreaming ever proved mostly the vigor, which meant that Crossus' best bet lay in contacting the Lord of Time, whose servants had already rejected the wizard's request more than once. Still, what else could he do but try again? Crossus rose, hurrying to a bench upon which many of the items of his calling stood arranged in vials and flasks. He scanned row upon row of jars, eyes quickly passing over chemicals and magical items that would have left his counterparts in the Carantor greatly envious, and more than a little curious as to how he could have obtained many of the articles in question, if they ever realized just how long he had been practicing the arts. There, a small flask containing a single withered flower caused him to pause. The Aeon rose, found only in one place in all the world, plucked by Crossus himself to give his mistress his love, saved by Crossus when the orcs stormed the lair and to his belief took her and the others prisoner. The Aeon rose, 5 petals of astonishing different hues surrounding a golden sphere in the center. As Crossus lifted the top of the flask, a faint scent that suddenly recalled his adolescence wafted under his nose. With some hesitation, he reached in, took hold of the faded boom, and marveled as it suddenly returned to its legendary brilliance the moment his tapering fingers touched it. Fiery red, emerald green, snowy silver, deep sea blue, midnight black. Each petal radiated such beauty as artists only dreamed of. No other object could surpass its inert beauty. No other flower could match its wondrous scent. Holding his breath for a moment, Crosses crushed the wondrous bloom. He let the fragments fall into his other hand. A tingle spread from palm to his fingers, but the dragon mage ignored it. Holding the remnants up high over his head, the wizard muttered words of power, then threw what was left of the faded rose onto the floor. The fabled rose onto the floor. But as the crushed pieces touched the stone, they turned suddenly to sand that spread across the chamber floor, overwhelming the chamber itself, washed across the chamber, covering everything, eating away everything, and leaving Crosses abruptly standing in the midst of an endless, swirling desert. Yet, no desert such as this had any mortal, or even Crosses himself for that matter, ever witnessed. For here lay scattered, as far as I could see, fragments of walls, cracked and scoured statues, rusted weapons, and the mage gaped, even the half-buried bones of some gargantuan beast that in life had dwarfed even dragons. There were buildings too, and although at first one might have thought they were the relics around them, all part of one vast civilization, a closer look revealed that no one structure truly belonged to another. A teeming tower, such as might have been built by humans in Lordaeron, overshadowed a doomed building that surely had come from the dwarfs. Some distance farther, an arched temple, its roof caved in, hinted of the lost kingdom of Azeroth. Near to Crossus himself stood a Mordor domicile, the quarters of some orc chieftain. A ship large enough to carry a dozen men stood propped on a dune, the latter half of it buried under sand. Armor from the reign of the first king of Stormgrade glittered among the smaller dune. The leaning statue of an elven cleric seemed to say final prayers over both vessel and armor. An astonishing, improbable display that gave even Crossus pause. In truth, the sights before the wizard resembled nothing more than some gargantuan deity's macabre collection of antiquities, a point not far from fact. None of these artifacts were native to this realm. In fact, no race, no civilization had ever been spawned here. All the wonders that stood before the wizard had been gathered quite meticulously over a period of countless centuries from other points all over the world. Crossus could scarcely believe what he saw, for the effort alone staggered even his imagination to bring such relics, so many of them so massive or so delicate, to this place. Yet, despite all of it, despite the spectacle before his eyes, an impatience began to build up as Crassus waited, and waited, and waited more, with not even the slightest hint that anyone acknowledged his presence. His patience, only left ragged by the events of the past weeks, finally snapped. He fixed his gaze on the stony features of a massive statue, part man, part bull, whose left arm thrust forth as if demanding the newcomer to leave, and called out, "I know you are here, Nazdormu. I know it. I would speak with you." The moment the dragon mage finished, the wind whisked up, tossing sand all about and obscuring his vision. Crossus stayed his ground as a full-fledged sandstorm suddenly buffeted him. The wind howled around him, so loud that he had to cover his ears. The storm seemed determined to lift him up and throw him far away. But the wizard fought it, using magic as well as physical effort to remain. He would not be turned away, not without the opportunity to speak. At last, even the sandstorm appeared to realize that he would not be deterred. It swept away from him, now focusing on a dune a short distance away. A funnel of dust arose, pushing higher and higher into the sky. The funnel took on a shape, a dragon's shape, as large as, if not larger, than Malagos. This sandy creation moved, stretching dusty brown wings. Sand continued to add to the dimension of the behemoth, with sand seemingly mixed with gold, for more and more Leviathan forming before crosses glittered in the blazing light of the desert sun. The wind died, yet not one grain of sand or gold broke from the draconic giant. The wings flapped hard, the neck stretched. Eyelids opened, revealing gleaming gemstones the color of sun. Corialistras. Corialistras, the sand behemoth particularly splat. You dare disturb my rest. You dare disturb my peace. I dare, because I must, O great Lord of Time. Titles will not surpass my wrath. It would be best if you went, the gemstones flared, and went now. No, not until I speak to you, of a dragon to all dragons, to all creatures. Nasdormu snorted. A cloud of sand bathed Crassus, but his spells kept it from affecting him. One could never tell what magic might dwell within each and every grain in the domain of Nasdormu. One bit of sand might be enough to ensure the history of a dragon named Corialistras turned out never to have happened. Crassus might simply cease to exist, remembered even by his beloved mistress. Unremembered even by his beloved mistress. Dragons, you say? Of what concern is that to you? I see only one dragon here, and it is certainly not the mortal wizard Crassus. Not anymore. Away with you. I would return you to my collection. You waste too much of my precious time already. One wing slept protectively over the statue of the man-bull. So much to gather, so much to catalog. It suddenly infuriated Crassus that this, one of the greatest of the five aspects, he threw the whom time itself cursed. This dragon cared not a whit what went on in the present or the future. Only his precious collection of the world's past meant anything to Leviathan. He went out to his servants, his people, to gather whatever he could find. Also, that their master could surround himself with what had once been and ignore what was and what might be. Also that he, in his own way, could ignore the passing of their kind, just as Malagos did. Nasdormu, he shouted, demanding the glittering sand dragon's attention. Deathwing lives. To his horror, Nasdormu took in his terrible news with little change. The golden brown behemoth snorted once more, sending a second cloud assaulting the tinier figure. Yes, and so? Taken back, Crassus managed to blurt, You know? A question not at all worth answering. Now, If you have nothing more in which to further before me, it is time for you to depart." The dragon reared his head, bejeweled eyes flaring. "Wait!" Forging any sense of dignity, the wizard waved his arms back and forth. To his relief, Nozdremu paused, negating the spell that he had been about to get rid of himself with his bothersome might. "If you know that the Dark One lives, you know what he intends. How can you ignore that?" "Because, as with all things, even Deathwing will pass into my time. Eventually, even he will eventually be part of my collection. But if you joined, you've had your say." The glittering sand dragon rose higher, and as he did, the desert flew up, adding further to his girth and form. Torn free by winds, some of the smaller objects in Nozdremu's bizarre collection joined with the sand, becoming, for the moment, a very part of the dragon. "Now leave me be." The wings now whipped around Crassus, and only Crassus. Try as he might, this time the dragon wizard could not hold his ground. He stumbled back, shoved hard time and time again by the ferocious gusts. "I came here for the sake of all of us," Crassus managed to shout. "You should have not disturbed my rest. You should have not come at all." The glittering gemstones flared. "In fact, that would have been best of all." A column of sand shot from the ground, engulfing the helpless wizard. Crassus could see nothing else. It grew stifling, impossible to breathe. He tried to cast a spell in order to save himself, but against the might of the aspects, against the master of time, even his substantial powers proved minuscule. Bereft of air, Crassus finally succumbed. Consciousness fading, he slumped forward and watched in startlement as the petals of the Aeon Rose dropped to the floor of his sanctum without any effect. The spell should have worked. He should have been transported to the realm of Nozdremu, the Lord of Centuries. But just as Malygos embodied magic itself, so too did Nozdremu represent time and timelessness. One of the most powerful of the 5 aspects, he had proven a powerful ally, especially should Malygos suddenly choose to retreat into his madness. Without Nozdremu, Crassus' hopes of success dwindled much. Kneeling, the mage picked up the petals and repeated the spell. For his troubles, Crassus was rewarded only with horrendous headache. How could that be, though? He had done everything right. The spell should have worked, unless somehow Nozdremu had caught wind of the wizard's intention to plead with him and had cast a spell preventing Crassus from entering the sandy realm. He swore, without a chance to visit Nozdremu, he had no hope. However slight it might have been in the first place, of convincing the powerful dragon to join his plan. That left only she of the dreaming, the most elusive of aspects, and the only one he had never, ever spoken with in all of his lengthy life. Crassus did not even know how to contact her, for it had oft been said that Yrsa lived not wholly in the real world, that to her the dreams were reality. The dreams were the reality. A desperate plan occurred to the wizard, one that had been suggested to him by any of his counterparts would have made Crassus break from accustomed form and laugh loud. How utterly ridiculous, how utterly hopeless. But as with Nozdremu, what other choice did he have? Turning back to his array of potions, artifacts, and powders, Crassus searched for a black vial. He found it quickly. Despite not having touched it more than a century, the last time he made use of it, it had been to slay what had seemed unslayable. Now, however, he sought only to borrow one of its most vicious traits, in hope that he did not measure wrong. 3 drops of the tip of a single bolt had killed the Manta, the behemoth of the deep. 3 drops had slain a creature 10 times the size of the strength of a dragon. Like Deathwing, nearly all had believed the Manta unstoppable. Now Crassus intended to take some of the poison for himself. The deepest sleep, the deepest dreams, he muttered to himself as he took the vial down. That is where she must be, where she has to be. From another shelf, he removed a cup and a small flask of pure water. Measuring out a single swallow in the cup, the dragon mage then opened the vial, and with the greatest caution, he brought open bottle to the cup of water. 3 drops to slay, and second, Samantha. How many drops to assist Crassus in most treacherous of journeys? Sleep and death. They were so very close in nature, more than that most realize. Surely he would find Yrsa there. The tiniest drop he could measure fell silently into the water. Crassus replaced the top of the vial and took up the cup. A bench, he murmured. Best to use a bench. One immediately formed behind him, a well-cushioned bench, upon which the king of Lordaeron would have happily slept. Crassus, too, intended to sleep well on it. Perhaps forever. He sat upon it, then raised the cup to his lips, yet before he could bring himself to drink what might be his last, the dragon in human guise made one last toast. To you, my Alexstrasza, always to you. End scene. There was someone here, all right, Verisa muttered, studying the realm. One of them was human. The other I can't be certain about. Pray tell, how do you know the difference? Asked Falstad, squinting. He could not tell one sign from the other. In fact, he could not even see half of what the elf saw. Look here, the boot print. She indicated a curved mark in the dirt. These are human-style boots, tight-fitting and uncomfortable. I'll take your word. And the other? The one you can't identify? The ranger straightened. Well, clearly, there are no signs of dragon being around. But there are tracks over here which match nothing I know. She knew that once again. Falstad could not see what her sharpness eyes screamed out their curious presence. Dwarf did his best, though, studying the peculiar striation of the earth. You mean these, my elven lady? The marks appeared to flow toward where the human, surely Ronan, had at one time or another stood. Yet, they were not footprints, not even paw prints. To her eyes, it looked as if something floated, dragging something behind it. This gets us no closer than the first spot this little green beast brought us to. Falstad seized Krill by the scruff of his neck. The goblin had both hands tied behind him and roped around his waist, the other end of which had been tied around the neck of the griffin. Despite that, neither Verisa nor the wild dwarf trusted that their unwilling companion might not somehow escape. Falstad especially kept his eye on Krill. Well, now what? It is becoming clear to me that you're leading us around. I doubt you've seen the wizard. I have, yes I have, Krill smiled wildly, possibly in the hope of swaying his captors, but a goblin's toothy grin did little to impress the outside of their race. Describe him, didn't I? You know I saw him, don't you? Verisa noticed that the griffin's sniffing at something hidden behind a bit of foliage. Using her sword, she prodded the spot, then dragged the object in question. At the tip of her sword hung a small, empty wine sack. The elf brought it to her nose. A heavenly bouquet wafted past. The elf briefly closed her eyes. Falstad misread her expression. As bad as that? Must have been dwarf ale. On the contrary, I have not come across such a fabulous aroma, even at the table of my lord back in Quathalos. Whatever wine filled this sack, far shone even the best of his stock. Which means, to my feeble mind, dropping the sack, Verisa shook her head. I do not know, but somehow I cannot help thinking that means that Ronan was here, if only for a time. Her companion gave her a skeptical look. My elven lady, it is possible that you simply wish it to be true. Can you answer me who else might have been in this region, drinking wine fit for kings? Hey, the Dark One, after he sucked the marrow from the bones of your wizard. His words made her shiver, but she remained steadfast in her belief. No, if Deathwing brought him this far, he had some other reason than a repast. Possible, I suppose. Still holding on to the goblin, Falstaff glanced up at the darkening sky. If we hope to get much farther before night, we'd best be getting on our way. Risa touched the tip of her blade against Krell's throat. We need to deal with this one first. What's to deal with? Either we take him with us, or do the world a favor and leave it with one less goblin to worry about. No, I promise to release him. The dwarf's heavy brow furrowed. I don't think that's wise. Nevertheless, I made that promise. She stared at him, knowing that if he understood elves as much as he should, Faust had to see the sense in not pursuing this argument. Sure enough, the Griffin Rider nodded, albeit with much reluctance. "'Tis as you say. You made a promise, and I'll not be the one to try to sway you on it." Not quite under his breath, he added, "Not only one lifetime to me. Not with only one lifetime to me." Satisfied, Risa expertly cut the bonds around Krill's wrists, then removed the loop from his waist. Goblin fairly bounced around, so overjoyed did he seem by his release. "Thank you, my behemoth mistress, thank you." The manager turned to tip the sword back to the creature's throat. "Thank you, my benevolent mistress. Thank you." The ranger turned the tip of the sword back toward the creature's throat. "Before you go, though, a few last questions. Do you know the path to Grand Portal?" Falstaff did not take this question well. Brow arched, he muttered, "What are you thinking?" She purposely ignored his question. "Well?" Krill's eye had gone wide the moment she asked. The goblin looked ashen, or at least paler shade of green. "No one goes to Grimbatal, benevolent mistress. Orcs there, and dragons too. Dragons eat goblins. Answer my question." He swallowed, finally bobbed his oversized head up and down. "Yes, mistress, I know the way. Do you think the wizard is there?" "Can't be serious, Verisa," Falstaff mumbled, so upset he had for once called her by her name. "If your Ronin is in Grimbatal, then he's lost to us." Perhaps not," Falstaff. "I think he always wanted to reach that place, and not simply to observe the orcs. I think he has some other reason, although what could it have to do with Deathwing, I cannot say. Maybe he plans on releasing the Dragon Queen single-handedly," the Griffin Rider returned with a snort of derision. "He's a mage, after all, and everyone knows they're all mad." And suddenly, an absurd notion, but for a moment it gave Verisa pause. No, it could be that. Creel, meanwhile, seemed to be trying to think really hard about something that didn't at all look to please him. At last, his face screwed up in expression. Excuse me. Creel, meanwhile, seemed to be trying to really think hard about something that did not at all look to please him. At last, his face screwed up in an expression of distaste. He muttered, "Mistress wants to go to Grimbatal?" The ranger considered it. It went even beyond her oath, but she had to push forward. Yes, I do. Now see here, you do not have time. You do not have to come with me, if you do not want to, Faust said. I thank you for your aid thus far, but I can proceed from here alone. The dwarf shook his head vehemently. And leave you alone in the middle of orc territory with only this untrustworthy little wretch? Nay, my elven lady, Falstad will not leave the fair damsel. Whether capable a warrior she might also be, on her own. We go together. In truth, she appreciated his company here. You may turn back any time, though. Remember that. Only if you're with me. She glanced at Creel. Well, can you tell me the way? Cannot tell you, mistress. More and more spindly creatures expression. Cannot tell you, mistress. More and more, the spindly creature's expression soured. Best if I show you instead. This surprised her. I grant you freedom, Creel. For which this poor wretch is so eternally grateful, mistress. But only one path Grimbatal offers, certainly. Without me, he dared look slightly egotistical. Neither elf nor dwarf will find it. We've got my mount. What, you little rodent? We'll simply fly over. In the land of dragons, the goblins chuckled, a hint of madness there. Best to fly right into their mouths and be done with it. No. To enter Grimbatal, if that's truly what the mistress desires, we'll have to follow me. Falstad would not hear of that immediately and protested, but Verisa saw no choice but to do as the goblin suggested. Creel had led them true so far, and although she did not, of course, trust him entirely, she felt certain that she would recognize it if he tried to lead them astray. Besides, clearly the goblin wanted nothing to do with Grimbatal himself, or else he would have been where they had found him, and he wouldn't have been where they had found him. Any of his kind who served the orcs would have been the mountain's fortress, not wandering the dangerous wilds of Cosmodin. And if he could lead her to Ronan. Having convinced herself that she chose correctly, Verisa faced the door. I will go with him, Falstad. It is the only choice I have. His broad shoulders slumped. Falstad sighed. 'Tis against my better judgment, but I'll go with you. If you keep an eye on this one, so I can lop off his traitorous head if I prove right. Creel, we must go on foot the entire way? The misshapen little creature mused for a moment, then replied, No, can travel some distance with Griffin. He gave her a smile full of teeth. Know just where best should land. Despite his apparent misgivings, Falstad started for the Griffin. Just tell us where to go, you little rodent. The sooner we get there, the sooner you can be on your way. The goblin's weight added to the powerful animal's burden, and soon the Griffin was on its way. Falstad, of course, sat in front, the better to control his mount. Creel sat behind him, with Verisa taking up the rear. The elf had resheathed her sword, and now held a dagger ready in the case of their undesired companion attempting something. Yet although the goblin's directions were not always the clearest, Farisa saw nothing that hinted of duplicity. He kept them near to the ground, always guided them along paths that steered them from open areas. In the distance, the mountain of Grimbatal grew nearer. A sense of anxiety spread through the ranger as she realized that she approached her goal, but anxiousness was tempered by the fact that even now she had come across no sign of either Ronan or the Black Dragon. Surely, this close to the mountain fortress, the orcs would be able to sight such a leviathan. And if I was thinking dragons allowed one to conjure them up, Falstad suddenly pointed east, where a massive form rose in the sky. "Big," he called, "big and red and fresh of blood. Scalps from Grimbatal." Krill immediately acted. "Down there," Goblin pointed at a ravine. "Many places to hide, even for a griffin." With little other than choice, the dwarf obeyed, guiding his mount earthward. The dragon's form grew larger and larger, for Risa noted that the crimson beast also had a more northerly direction, possibly to the very northern border of Cosmodon, where the last desperate forces of the Horde sought to hold back the Alliance. That made her wonder about the situation there. Had the humans begun their advance at last? Could the Alliance itself even now be halfway to Grimbatal? If so, it would be too late for her purposes. Yet the nearing presence of the Alliance might aid in one way. If it made the orcs here concentrate on matters other than their own immediate defenses. The griffin aligned in the ravine, the animal instinctively seeking the shadows. No coward, the griffin had the sense to know when to choose a battle. Vresis and the others leapt off, finding their own places to hide. Krill pressed himself against one rocky wall, his expression that of open terror. The ranger actually found herself feeling more sympathy for him. They waited for several minutes, but the dragon did not fly by. After what seemed far too long a time, the impatient ranger decided to see for herself if the beast had changed direction, getting a proper grip on the rock she climbed. The elf saw nothing in the darkening sky, not even a speck. In fact, Free suspected that they could have departed this ravine long before, if only one of them had dared to look. "No sign," whispered Falstad, climbing up beside her. For a dwarf, he proved himself quite nimble, crawling up the side. "We're clear. Very much so." "Good. Unlike my hill cousins, I've no taste for holes in the ground." He started down. "All right, Krill, the danger's done. You can peel yourself." The moment his voice cut off, Risa jerked her head around. "What is it?" "That damn spawn of frogs gone." He scrambled down the rest of the way, vanished like a will-o'-the-wisp. Dropping down as safe as he could, the ranger joined Falstad in scanning the immediate area. Sure enough, despite the fact that they should have been able to see the goblin's retreating figure in either direction, not one sign of Krill existed. Even the griffin acted baffled, as if, too, had not even noticed the spindly creature had run off. How could he have just disappeared? "Wish I knew that myself, my dear elven lady. A neat trick. Can your griffin hunt him down?" "Why not just let him go? We're better off without him." The ground underneath her feet suddenly softened, broke apart. The elf's boots sank deep within seconds. Thinking that she had just walked into the mud, she tried to pull herself free. Instead, Farisa only sunk deeper, in an alarming rate. It almost felt as if she were being pulled down. "What in the name of Airy?" Falstad, too, had sunk deep, but the dwarf's case that meant suddenly stood up to his knees in the dirt. Like the ranger, he attempted to extricate himself, only to completely fail. Risa grabbed for the nearest rock, trying to seize hold. For a moment, she succeeded, managing to slow her progress downward. Then something powerful seemed to take hold of her ankles, pulling with such force that the ranger could no longer keep her grip. Above them, she heard a panicked squawk. Unlike Farisa and the dwarf, the griffin had managed to pull up in time to avoid being dragged under. The animal fluttered above Falstad's head, trying, it seemed, to get a grip on its master. However, the beast dropped lower. Clumps of dirt suddenly shot up, trying, Friso realized in horror, to seize the mount. Griffin narrowly escaped, forced now to fly up so high the animal could not possibly aid either warrior, which Friso with no notion as to how to escape. Already the earth came up to her waist. The thought of being buried alive set even the elf on edge, yet in comparison to Falsad's predicament, hers seemed slightly less imitable. Though a dwarf shorter stature, he had already had trouble keeping his head above the ground. Try as he might, even the mighty strength of the griffin rider could not help him. He grabbed furiously at the soft earth, ripping handfuls that did him no good whatsoever. In desperation, the ranger reached out. Falsad, my hand, reach for it. He tried. They both tried. The gap between them had grown too great, however. In growing horror, Friso watched as her struggling companion was inevitably pulled under. My, was all he managed before disappearing from sight. Now buried up to her chest, she froze for a moment, staring at the slight mound of dirt that was all remained to mark his passage. The ground there did not even stir. No last thrust of a hand, no wild movement underneath. Falsad, she murmured. Renewed force at her ankles tugged her deep, as the dwarf had done. Risa snatched at the earth around her, digging deep valleys with her fingers, but doing herself no good. Her shoulders sank in. She lifted her head skyward, but the griffin saw no sign, but another figure, so very familiar, now leaned out from a small crevice that the elf had missed earlier. Even the waging light she could see Krill's toothy smile. Forgive me, my mistress, but the Dark One insists that no one interfere, and so that he left me with the task of seeing you to your deaths. A menial bit of work, and one undeserving of a clever mind such as mine. But master does, after all, have very large teeth, and so sharp claws. I certainly couldn't refuse him, could I? His grin stretched wider. I hope you understand. Damn you. The ground swallowed her up. Dirt filled the elf's mouth. Then, seemingly, her lungs. She blacked out.